Ready to start our first informal plenary to pursue all the work that has been done on consultations and ideas on our HFA2, as we call it. It's a working name. It's not to prejudice the future. As I think almost all of you here are familiar, but in the Global Platform 2011, that's now exactly 2 years ago, in fact, we started the conversation about what do we do with the Hyogo Framework for Action, which has had the first iteration period 2005 to 15. And it became very clear in the Global Platform that there was a great desire to keep working, but there was also a great necessity to keep working. Subsequently, based on your message, the UN General Assembly also said that they endorse fully and recommend the continued work. And they asked us to start the consultations. Now, a year ago, pretty precisely, we launched the consultations here in Geneva together with the ambassador of Japan. And the consultations have been taking place at the regional level through our regional platforms and ministerial conferences, but also in many, many other settings. Some countries have done national consultations, really reviewed their own progress and analyze what they need for the future. Many other organizations and groups, civil society organizations, NGOs, the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, science groups, they have tried to contribute to take stock to what is at stake. You have seen the synthesis report, which is aiming to be a fair summary of what has come out in the consultations. And you also have access to a website at UNISDR and Prevention Web, which posts the document reports from many of your consultations. But that's, of course, only part of the substance. Part of this is also all the other conversations that are going on globally on the post-2015 development agenda, the climate issues. So I think what you've heard this morning already is a very strong call for, again, a strong call for an acceleration of how we have a better unity between these agendas. So this is the context to date. We will spend today, Tuesday, Wednesday afternoon, 3 hours each afternoon in discussions that we are happy to give some structure to. We are hoping to focus you perhaps on the themes of today, the private sector financing, risk financing, and tomorrow we have a strong focus on communities in different forms, but as always, this is an informal plenary, so you are welcome to say what you have on your mind, but our ambition is, of course, to try to make a structured outcome of this. On Thursday, we will have, just before we have the closing ceremony, we will have a shorter session where we bring together and summarize these discussions. And we also give you an idea about the continued consultations. What we do hope to get out of the consultations here is also some guidance for a much more focused consultation in the next 6 months after the Global Platform, before we start putting pen to paper and bring together all the elements and the emphasis. I think there are some important messages that have come out, and maybe there isn't so much new to say about risks, but there is a lot to say about how we implement the means and structures, mechanisms, resources, and how to get a recognition of the considerable resilience challenges that countries and communities and individual people face, and bring the knowledge about what to do closer to the action point. We also, in order to ensure that a lot of the people who are not able to travel to Geneva to participate in this conference, And even though the participation in this particular meeting is double from what it has been before, not only in terms of numbers of people, but also in the diversity. I think every community that has been reached out to is here, but also many community groups. We've got many people living with disabilities who've decided to join this. There are young children, young people, of course the women group, heritage groups. We have local governments, science groups, parliamentarians, business people, and governments, of course. I hope you've had a chance to see the enormous diversity here. I think we also have more participation from Asia, Africa, and the Arab world than ever before, which I take as a message that these regions are determined to have their voice heard as we move along now and determine what should be the contents and the form of the Post-2015 Hyogo Framework for Action. We also have had a virtual platform. We've opened a discussion space on our website, a bit guided around the same questions that we are asking you. And we had some feedback from them, which I can share with you a little bit later. We'll also give you some feedback from other discussions here, but we really would like you to take the lead in this discussion now. As by tradition, and I do not only have a co-chair, but I always have the same co-chair on the first day, which is the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization, Mr. Michel Charot, who is a very determined supporter of disaster risk reduction for very good reasons, and I'll leave it to him to say that to you. So Michel, can I ask you to also give your opening direction to how you see this opportunity now for discussions?
Thank you very much, Margareta, and welcome to all of you. Actually, Margareta asked me to inject one particular perspective, was the significance of the HFA2 and the relevance to the post-2015 development agenda. As we know, 2015 is really a critical year for many reasons. Of course, it is Hyogo plus 10, and the post-2015 is also about taking stock of what we have learned from these 10 years of the Hyogo Framework. And it was about giving impetus to disaster prevention, to disaster reduction, to building resilience. But how can we make it, how can we go even further? How can we make it sustainable? 2015 is also critical for the Sustainable Development Agenda. We know we are approaching the end of the MDGs. There's been lots of discussion, including recently in Rio Plus 20, and all of you, I'm sure, are involved in this discussion about what will be the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. And there is no Sustainable Development Agenda if we don't tackle disaster reduction. So the two are connected. But there's a third complicating factor, which initially was a sort of post-2012 agenda. That was the post-Kyoto, climate change. But then, because of the way the process has been moving, now the key decision will have to be taken in 2015 as well. So in a sense, there's a coincidence of major decisions to be taken in 2015, and these decisions interact with each other. Climate change is going to have an impact on disaster. Disaster has an impact on sustainable development. Development has an impact on climate change. So the message is that we cannot deal with this issue any longer in sort of silos. We have to deal with them in an integrated fashion, in a consolidated fashion. And it's not only for governments to take action. Of course, it's very important. Government have a key role to play, but it's also all the communities, from the local communities to the various governments, and indeed, actually, decision to be taken in the context of the United Nations system. So it is very important, this kind of gathering, like the one we have now, this global platform, and I'm very happy to see that in this room. Of course, I cannot see on your face from which sector you are coming from, but Margareta said that there are people from all kinds of angles of society, and it is essential because we cannot solve the problem if we don't work together. So here, what we expect from this informal plenary is, of course, to inject a few questions to you, a few things, and we need your feedback so that afterwards we can all, we can get your feedback to our respective organization, and afterwards make sure, as I say, we cannot solve it in isolation, that we can work together. And when it comes to disaster prevention, the working together comes under the umbrella of the ISDR. So Margareta is our boss on that issue. So I will, but it's very important that we work for that with a sort of holistic fashion. We cannot solve the problems in isolation any longer. Now, maybe before if I can inject one or two more messages. Over the last 30 years, we have made enormous progress to save lives. The toll of disaster is still too heavy, still too many lives are being lost. However, it is much less than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And the reasons for that are multiple. One of the reasons is that we can issue, for at least the most frequent disasters, the weather, water, climate-related disasters, we can issue better and better early warnings. But it's not sufficient. It's also because these early warnings are better integrated in disaster prevention mechanism. And that saves lives. There's absolutely no doubt about it, even though we should save even more lives. But the economic cost is increasing dramatically. And this has a huge impact on sustainable development, because often countries in the development phase are hit by a disaster and then back to square one or back to square zero for some of them. So point number one. Point number two, and this is again, I think very important for this kind of audience. How can we make sure that we strengthen the investment in disaster prevention? You know that all too often actions are triggered, are accelerated by a major disaster. There's a lot of sensitization, a lot of action is taken afterwards, there's a little window of opportunity, but this window of opportunity tend to close very quickly, and often we just rebuild because there's urgency, because we rebuild in the same place with the same thing, but not necessarily better and not necessarily in a more resilient way. So I would plead that not only it is important to increase the investment in disaster prevention, very good investment, but also that it's important to do it better. And to do it better, there's no miracle. We need to provide to all decision makers better information, so that decision to do it better should be informed by science. Let me stop here, Margareta. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel. So I'd just like to open the floor and invite ideas. You know, the synthesis report, in fact, many people have said, well, yes, this reflects very well where we are, but does it give us any guidance for the future, is a question I would have, or do we have to take a quantum leap in some direction? My second question would be just to trigger some ideas from you. There's a strong message, and in fact now I would say a very strong acceptance that the HFA2 builds on HFA1. In other words, for all those countries that are in the middle of building systems, which HFA is pretty much about, they should not feel that they are disrupted and there is a new instrument, but there is let's say, an elevation of the continuation of the earlier element. But think about the opportunity now with all the attention. What are the most critical courses of action to take to genuinely impact risk? There are many things we can and should do, but if we want to have an impact in the next 4 years, let's say, what are the areas to focus on? What will have a genuine impact? And my third perspective is the Hyogo Framework for Action is an international cooperation framework. So the way it works is that it helps to motivate, energize, and to some degree guide what countries can do. but it doesn't impose any obligation on them, because many countries definitely know what they are doing and can do more. So keep thinking about what can an international cooperation instrument actually do to tackle the obstacles, the bottlenecks that you see, so that in 4 years you could genuinely measure some progress. Colleagues, the floor is open. We've talked enough from the top table. Now we are in your hands. We are here to listen. Yes, please. This is the Africa Union Commission. Yeah. Aitza. Can I ask you to please identify yourself when you take the floor, so also people don't see you from the back, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, we are the League of Arab States. I am sorry, I thought this is informal consultation, so we will not have translations, but after I came, I discovered that we have translation. I would have preferred to speak in Arabic, but I prepared whatever I have in English. Actually, what I'm going to do is just to share with you the views of the Arab region concerning HFA2. The Arab region held a first Arab conference on disaster risk reduction, in which post-HFA2 was discussed, and the position they take on that issue was crystallized. The Arab region is with the view that there are emergent issues that need to be tackled in HFA2. Namely institutional mechanisms and governance, climate change and local resilience, and the link between disaster risk reduction and development planning. It was also mentioned that it is critical that governments, communities, business people view disaster risk reduction as an initiative for investment and not a cost. It is also viewed as a core, disaster risk reduction is viewed as a core development issue and an enabler of development. Also, there is a need to assess risks and development appropriate programs to reduce these risks. It is also necessary to equip governments with the information and knowledge base to identify and assess major risks and design a proper policy framework and disaster risk reduction plans. Of course, this will include risk assessment, hazard mapping, etc. It is also important to develop comprehensive urban development plans as part of a regional or national plan that incorporates climate change adaptation, proper urban planning, and enforcement of construction codes. The issue of enforcement actually took a great deal of emphasis. Disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and sustainable development goals at a global level have to be integrated into a comprehensive framework that is flexible, forward-looking, and able to address emerging risks. Also, it is necessary to build on traditional knowledge and skills that was developed to maintain and as well as conserve historical environment and landscape. And this puts also the issue of integrating heritage. So concerning there was also critical emphasis on the institutional framework and coordination and cooperation at the national level concerning disaster risk reduction. It was believed that HFA2 has to find a way to make government coordinate internally in that issue, to build internal capacities of all national and local institutions tasked with planning, managing, and implementing disaster risk reduction, and the construction of an information and knowledge base for disaster risk reduction as well as coordination between the various response teams. Laws and instructions are needed to ensure mandatory risk assessment that feed into disaster risk reduction strategies. Planning and responding to disaster risk reduction should be a comprehensive approach that includes all the necessary stakeholders. It is necessary to develop disaster risk response plans that are clear, realistic, and implementable, and that set accountability measures at all levels for all involved institutions. Also inform and equip the public with the needed knowledge to respond proactively. And the private sector, especially the insurance and construction sectors, need to be integrated into the process. Moreover, to establish a platform to engage the young generation and promote the DRR process by leveraging youth. And this, of course, you know, the youth situation in the Arab countries is getting momentum at the moment, so this was a result of that. Women are agents of change and should therefore be involved in the disaster risk reduction process, and as well as strengthening and engaging the academia and science in supporting disaster risk reduction, particularly applied research. Also, issues concerning climate change were brought up, as well as urbanization and unchecked urban expansion, in which housing codes were, the necessity of housing codes was stressed, and the major issues was disaster risk reduction finance. And actually, the concept of the fact that disaster risk reduction is much more cost effective than financing recovery, response, and reconstruction was very eminent in the discussion. And it is important to mitigate the harsh effects of disasters. Comprehensive risks financing strategies need to be developed, and governments need to invest more in basic social services. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. This is a very strong and all-encompassing message from the Arab states, which actually has just a few months ago had the first regional conference at senior technical level ever. There were a few issues that you picked up on there that are really issues that keep coming up. The issue of how do you govern DRR? Where does responsibility sit? Internal coordination and cooperation issues. I hope that we will conduct a conversation here, so I encourage you to make short interventions and hopefully launch questions to your other colleagues here in the audience. Someone named Wilcox has his plate up, so Wilcox, the floor is yours. Tim, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Timothy Wilcox. I'm the Sub-Regional Coordinator for the Pacific for UNISDR. And Pacific Island countries are living with more frequent and devastating natural disasters. Plus, they are living with direct impact of climate change, where some countries may actually be underwater in 50 years' time. Some of these islands, if a tsunami hit them, the population, let's say if they suffered damage of 2,000 people died from that tsunami, that is actually the entire population of that country. It's a small number in other parts of the world, but to lose an entire country from one disaster is a significant, disaster for the region. At the moment in the region, climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction activities are actually very fragmented. Now, the Pacific countries have agreed that integrating climate change adaptation activities and disaster risk reduction is a priority for their region. In many cases, these two activities are the same. and it's important, and I'd like to collaborate with my learned colleague from the Arab states in asking for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction to be fully integrated for the post-2015. The region is definitely looking at having one strategy so that everything can stay on track. I'd like to leave it there to keep that short, but I'd also like to ask any of my colleagues in the room from the Pacific to also share their views on the matter as well.
Thank you. I'll invite you to do that. Meanwhile, I will ask if there is any country here or institution that has fully managed to integrate climate and disaster policies, practices, and financing for implementation, to share with the rest of us how that was possible to be done. Because I can share with you there's so many comments about the difficulty of doing this. So we welcome encouragement. Please.
Hello, my name is Mike Pedersen. I'm director of SOPAC, which is a division of the Secretary of the Pacific Community. So I'm going to back up Timothy's comments a little bit, but I'm not saying we've made huge progress in this in terms of integrating climate change and DRR, but actually for about 6 months to 1 year now, there's been a definite decision that this is happening. And the SPC itself, which represents 22 countries in the Pacific, one arm of the SPC is looking after climate change and climate change adaptation. And in my particular division, we're looking after disaster risk reduction. We're now working together in partnership. We've actually appointed a number of staff and a working group and a secretariat which straddle the area, so that some of them are experts in one field, some of them are experts in the other, and they're working together weekly or daily in some places. We've got what we're calling a roadmap with an actual way forward, with a set of meetings, a set of consultations, sub-regional group meetings, and we're bringing together various actors who traditionally would have worked separately together within one body. In about 8 weeks' time, in July, we've got the Pacific platform, where we've got actually maybe the first time in the world, perhaps, I don't know, but the first time we're actually bringing together, it's called Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, the way forward sort of thing. It's a platform where we've got many actors from government, non-government, private sector, etc. So that's another way forward. I think the other tool that's working very well is the Joint National Action Plans, or the JNAPs. And we've actually got some finished in a number of countries now, and in a lot more, almost finished. And this is for the first time the countries have wanted to do this. So I'm talking about countries like the Cook Islands. They've got a Joint National Action Plan up and running. I was just visiting the Marshall Islands. Theirs is almost finished. And many other countries that are in the Pacific are doing this. What they are seeing is a major impact on one of the issues recently was governance, yeah? What they are seeing is the JNAP is helping them advise government where the governance of both climate change and DRR should be. Bringing the two together increases the impact within government and persuades ministers that maybe the whole thing should be elevated to, if not a ministerial level, almost there, which is, I think, one of the aims of DRR. The other thing that they're telling me the JNAP does, and this is direct from the countries that have done it, that have not had a lot of experience in this before, is that it's bringing out clear priorities, it's informing investments, and it's informing the order of timing of actions. So we're still only a few months down the road, but I think things are starting to come together, and we are looking forward very much to July in Nandi, Fiji, at this meeting, where we can progress a lot of these ideas and crystallize them to the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we have some ideas. We need, you all have table microphones. So the gentleman here with glasses, and then after that the gentleman without glasses, and then I'll come to the front here. Please start.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Steve Gawler from ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. ICLEI has been partnering ISDR for the last 2 or 3 years. We helped to pilot the local government self-assessment tool. We worked with 9 cities in Asia and Africa. My organisation, ICLEI, also has funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and we are currently mobilising to work with something like 40 cities over the next 2 to 3 years in Asia to help them to become more climate change resilient. But we are very interested in incorporating the local government self-assessment tool for disaster preparedness into our overall approach and toolkit. As other commentators have already observed, the current local government self-assessment tool is still very disaster risk focused, naturally, that's where it came from. But we certainly endorse the views from our Pacific colleagues that we would like to bring those 2 disciplines much closer together now. And we've commenced work with one of the other partners from the Rockefeller Foundation Consortium to work on the LGSAT to make it a more integrated tool so that a city can use it as a diagnostic tool to assess its readiness for disasters, but also for other slower onset climate phenomena. Part of my reason for being here at this platform is to talk with particularly some of the ISDR partners about how to do that. My concern is it's fairly easy to amend the LGSAT to have a stronger emphasis on slow onset climate-related phenomena as well, but we don't want that to compromise its ability to form part of the reporting framework for HFA and HFA2. So I don't have an answer for that yet, but that's one of our considerations. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. I think probably there are many other considerations about making sure that the reporting is joined up, and I think we will have to look at both reporting mechanisms in the next year, also anticipating some new elements for 2015. So thank you for that offer, and I hope you will take ICLEI up on that. In fact, I think maybe lots of the changes that we need very rapidly will come from local governments. There is a lot of energy and space there. So now, my apologies for not knowing all of you by name, but yes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I'm from the South Pacific. I'm in here from Fiji. Fiji has also progressed in terms of our joint national action plans, as stated by Tim and Michael from SUPEC. We just wish to reiterate the fact that we are vulnerable, and particularly for climate change, and this is why the leadership has see it fit for us to amalgamate disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, because in as far as climate change is concerned, we are the small island developing states, particularly in the Pacific, are small contributors to climate change. But in terms of its effects, we are the worst affected, we could say. And that is why, because there are overlaps and duplications. And climate change, to some extent, becomes a hazard for us. And most of these small island developing states who are already vulnerable and have very small economies with undiversified economies as well. And probably this is why we would urge our strategic and international organizations and partners for more investment into disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in the Pacific Island countries. And most of us are towards the joint national action plans where we bring the 2 issues together. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the idea of the joined up national and the leadership that you have provided in doing what is practically necessary to join these 2 areas of work, I think must be given attention and followed by many others. Then I would like to invite Fatma Al-Mahla from formerly League of Arab States also, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 25 years ago, a main issue in the environmental forums was to include environmental impact assessment in feasibility studies. I think now it is high time to include disaster impact assessment for all projects, whether in pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studies, and during the lifetime of any project. Also, another important issue is that we have to, Hyogo Framework Action 2 should pay attention to 2 billion people that live in the dry lands. These areas will be drier due to climate change, and the drought will increase in intensity, duration, and frequency, and this will affect the lives, economies, business of people there. So the drought and dry lands should be a major issue in Hyogo Framework Action 2.
Thank you so much, Fatma. I would like to ask maybe Michelle, but also other experts that may be here in the room, what practical action is required for typically the drylands that are getting drier, and what can we expect of the economic basis of these areas? So what's reasonable to do? We have lots of pens in the air now. We have a little navigation chart here. Who would like to speak? But first I'll ask Satoru Nishikawa. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Right now I work with the Japan Water Agency, and regarding your question about climate adaptation, we do have concrete examples in Japan. And many of our water facilities, dams, reservoirs, waterways, they were designed based on the rainfall observations in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Now, since then, we have observed rainfall pattern changes, and there are more fluctuations in annual fluctuations and also seasonal fluctuations. But by seeing these changes, we had to adapt our facilities to adapt to the changes in the rainfall patterns. But it's not easy. We have many stakeholders in multi-purpose dams, multi-purpose waterways. So we have to gather evidence that this is real fluctuation, and it's not just an abnormal fluctuation. And if we have enough statistics and enough scientific evidence, we would be able to persuade the various stakeholders who pay for these facilities. And then we were able to convert some of our multi-purpose facilities and change their purposes. So this is an example of how scientific evidence and scientific observation can be a measure to persuade action. And also, on the other hand, it's not only the rainfall patterns that change. Changes in the rainfall patterns and changes in the temperature would change the agriculture patterns. So that also influences the demand for water. In Japan, rice is a staple crop. The main season for planting rice has shifted maybe 1 or 2 weeks earlier. Then we have to adapt to that as well. But I would like to emphasize that in order to persuade others to adapt, we need scientific evidence. And also, DRR is not standalone. We have to involve various sectors, the agricultural sector, the infrastructure sector as well. So I really would like to emphasize the importance, how can we involve other sectors in our process? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Michelle wanted also to comment on my question. Please.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I want to maybe to use the previous intervention to go even one step further. You are absolutely correct to say that for all the infrastructure which was built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, it was based, actually even those built in the 60s was based on statistical information from the previous 50 to 60 years. And the patterns have changed. But what will happen now is that these patterns of rainfall, temperature, and therefore water usage will change even faster and even more. So it's not only adapting to what we have now, but it is anticipating what we shall have in the next 20, 30, 50, even when you talk about water infrastructure, 100 years. And to do that is where it is very interesting, where I was mentioning that we need to connect these various silos together. In particular, it's very important to connect with the climate information with disaster management. In most countries, that's only true for the least developed countries, for the developing countries, but it's even true for the most developed countries. There is insufficient climate information in almost all the countries. So decisions are often not made based on the future scenario. They are based on the past, and the past is no longer a sufficient indicator for the future, for the reason you have just described. But it's also important to connect various disciplines, because when we are talking about water management, let's take a dam, for example. The dam can be used for many purposes. It can be used to produce electricity. It can be used to manage floods. It can be used to irrigate for water and many other usages. In most countries, this usage belongs to different ministries, different decision makers, different communities who are not used to cooperate with each other. Complicating factor, often river basins are shared across countries. So you cannot manage that only at the level of, it's not a local decision, this one. It is really, it has to be managed across borders as well. We know of examples, for example, where to manage a flood upstreams, water is released in a dam, and that just aggravates the floods in the countries downstream. We have multiple examples of that, or vice versa. There is a drought, and then we get water, and the water is depriving the countries downstream are deprived of this water. So it is now very important to anticipate what is going to happen. To do that, we, and by we I mean the whole global community. It's not only my organization, the World Meteorological Organization, but it's also in cooperation with ISDR, with the FAO, with UNESCO, with the World Health Organization, and so on. And I could mention almost everyone, to develop climate services which can be used for decision making. But these climate services are not in the traditional way. They are based also on the IPCC scenario. I'm sure you are familiar with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, assessing the state of climate change about every 6 years. And the decision makers have information in the form of scenarios, of probabilities, which are not so easy to act upon. So there's a whole paradigm shift which is required in the way to make decision in a context of uncertainty. Sometimes you will hear the skeptics about climate change to say, it's not perfect information, it means that you don't know anything. No, sorry, we know many things, but it's true, it's not 100% certainty, it's probability, scenario. It's better than what I would call the sort of past statistical knowledge. But this better is difficult to use, so we, meaning the scientific community, have to talk with you, the decision makers at all levels, from the farmers to the governments, how best we can interact to give you the information and information that you can use for decision making. That's a big challenge, and we are developing, it's called the Global Framework for Climate Services. It's a major undertaking by the whole global community. But it will be an essential element to break this silo. Silo, you know, we talk about resilience. Silos are incredibly resilient. You can destroy them, they come back, and even stronger. So we need to really work together, and together means across disciplines, across countries, across organizations. It's a huge challenge, but it's not a hopeless challenge at all.
Good, thank you. We can also say that without breaking down the barriers, no resilience. So
That's right.
we can see that as a serious opportunity now. Now I'm going to use my navigation chart, which says the third row, second in man. That must be you. Yes, please.
This is Syam Agrawal. I am secretary in the National Disaster Management Authority in Government of India. That's the national level outfit that does all these things. While thinking of a HFA2, what comes to my mind, I'll just broadly outline, and then of course we can think of, because it requires many more deliberations and many more sessions. The HFA as it is 2005 to 2015 basically emphasized the issues which are common to all sorts of disasters, like institutional framework, like legal framework. They can be applying to all different types of disasters. Maybe an idea that can be thought of is that HFA2 should build upon specific disasters. Like say earthquake has a major component like building codes. Flood has a major intermediate term objective of health aspects. Livelihood drought has a more of livelihood sustenance. There are different disasters which need different components to be emphasized. So this is one aspect that can be a guiding criteria for HFA2. In this regard, what I think of is that, say, knowledge. Knowledge is available in different, like say, today in the morning, the Minister Civil Defense of New Zealand said that they have drawn up a building code, very good building code, which has made them to face earthquake disaster in much better way. Such building codes by many other countries may be available in public domain. But many other countries are just not in the know of things that these things are available in public domain. I mean, can the UNISDR or this forum can be the knowledge disseminator? These are the things available. Then it is for concerned government, concerned sovereign government to take care of these aspects, to look into these aspects and draw upon these resources. I mean, this can be a very good methodology. That means what is available, then can you really augment and can you really update it? Augmentation can be also a regional framework, say SARC. Within SARC, probably India can do much better than probably many other smaller countries looking to their scientific manpower and the base of knowledge. So can the countries be urged that in a regional outfit, because the climatical and things like are there similar, so such resources should be built upon by those countries and should be made available. Similarly, dovetailing of financial resources. As you know, in India we have a big program wherein the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which really supports the livelihood sustenance. Can those assets be created out of that can be made towards the disaster proofing of the different structures that are available in the country? Some such ideas. Similarly, another idea can be benchmarking. Benchmarking can be in two respects. One is structural aspects and one is soft, like awareness generation, knowledge and these things. Structural aspects like building codes, structural aspects like asset creation, and institutional mechanism can be. I mean, my point is that the framework can be very broad, and at the same time, one thing that we need to recognize in all these structures is basically that the governance and sovereignty is one thing that every government is will like to hold it very strongly, not giving into any structure that may exist supranational. So to that extent, how to optimize both these aspects, prodding the governments that these are the sources available, why don't you do something? At the same time, drawing upon the best practices, that these are the best practices felt elsewhere, can you really help? I mean, something like that. And it has to be slightly more concrete than cross-cutting general, that institutional mechanism you do better, legal framework you do better. That cuts across everything. HFA2, I feel, should be slightly more specific to make it more useful or more utility oriented by the sovereign governments, because at the end of the day, disaster is an area for which the resources, largely of the sovereign resources, are put to use. However you do insurance and things, even the record that we found out is that only 20 to 30% is answered by this thing. 70 to 80% one has to fall back on the public resources of all the governments. So can you really do something wherein you create a facilitating environment, more disaster specific, and then connect to different governments that, okay, this is your area, this is your emphasis, you should be emphasizing more flood, not earthquake, you should be emphasizing more drought, not earthquake, and these are the specific areas probably you need to do some better preparedness. I mean, something like this. Of course, it needs a lot of thought. The opportunity.
Yeah. No, I'd like to thank you for some very concrete ideas about, practical acceleration methods. And as you say, it probably requires a lot more consideration, but the idea that you started with, that the HFA2 may benefit from having a lot more focus to drive action, is certainly one that has come up. And I think your other ideas also about how to motivate countries to be more generous with the resources they have to actually benefit others as well is something that we can build on. So I hope that will trigger some ideas from other colleagues here in the group. And I'd like to invite the Secretary General of Nepal Red Cross, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the floor, Madam Chair. On the integration of climate change and disaster risk reduction, I would like to highlight a couple of points. I represent Nepal Red Cross Society, and we have been working with the communities on disaster risk reduction for more than a decade and a half now. And in the recent years, we have developed approaches and strategies as well as frameworks to integrate disaster risk reduction and climate change into our work. As we work very closely with the communities, that has really created an impact at the community level. Secondly, the government of Nepal has come out with a national strategy on disaster risk management, where climate change has been identified as one of the priority areas. And to implement that national strategy for disaster risk management, a consortium has been established in Nepal, and 5 flagship areas have been identified. And in that consortium, different government, international financial institutions like World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and the donors are joining. And one of the flagship areas is integrated community-based disaster risk reduction. And together, all the partners have identified 9 minimum characteristics of a resilient community in Nepal, wherein the issue of climate change adaptation, climate change, as well as disaster risk reduction have been highlighted. So at the institutional level, also separate mechanism has been established by the government, and several sectoral policies, plans, strategies have been developed. So in a way, this has been institutionalized both at the governmental level as well as at the non-governmental level. So this is what I wanted to share. And on the HFA2, I also would like to make a couple of points. So in HFA2, I think it should be looked more from the holistic approach of community resilience than reducing risks related to hazard. So we need to look more from the perspective of holistic approach to disaster risk reduction. And bringing experience of working with the communities, certainly we need to find ways how science and indigenous knowledges could be combined together, and the lasting effect can be created at the community level. Thirdly, in HFA1, we talked more about the qualitative aspects of disaster risk reduction, but we need to focus more on the quantitative aspect in HFA2 as well. And we have been talking a lot about investment, resilience investment, and public-private partnership as well, which is good in itself. But still, we also need to find ways how the community participation could also be measured, because their contribution is also in manifold for reducing disaster risks and building resilience both at the community level and the nation as well, so that there should be concrete monitoring and evaluation plans in place, and there should be ways how the contribution of the communities could also be measured in HFA2. And also, we should find ways for legal instruments to be in place for building resilience. And also, there should be clear mentioning not only about what should be done, but how it should be done. We should be backed by institutional mechanisms and resources to achieve what we really intend for. Thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you very much. And yes, behind Nishikawa, there is a lady sitting. You have the floor, please. Yes. Afterwards, we'll come to you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Fatou Lakhdari, member of the Algerian delegation, a scientist. Allow me once again to emphasize certain risks which are in danger of strengthening with climate change, particularly drought, which has just been underlined, but I'd like to mention another risk, which is desertification, which is connected with drought. I would also say there's a third risk, which is the last stage of desertification, which is being covered with sand. And some countries can be struck by shock disasters such as earthquakes, landslides, and so on so forth. But in our region, there are risks which are insidious and do a lot of danger, do a lot of damage to the ecosystem, particularly to human settlements. And if you don't mind, I have some suggestions to make about 2012, that is to develop knowledge, even though it does exist already. We'll need it tomorrow even more, because climate is developing day from day in time and space. And I suggest that the scientific community throughout the world, particularly those concerned in the field, to note their observations. And when I say observations, I mean that from the geophysical point of view, covering climate and everything else, and the dynamic socioeconomic volume, because an ecosystem is made up of different factors, physical, biological, and also social. So all that needs to be integrated, because steps to be taken for a reliable, relevant strategy concerned with every change which happens because of the climatic dynamic has to be integrated, and everything we've noticed throughout the world, be they coastal zones, semi-arid zones, temperate zones, all areas of activity are affected for men and for women. And something else I think needs to be underlined for the post-2015 is awareness and education for future generations. It's a debt we have towards them. We have to inform them and prepare them for everything which has to do with climate in its various aspects. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, and please go ahead. Yeah.
Señora Presidenta, soy el coronel Bernardo Castro Sala.
I am from the Chilean army, and I'm part of the Chilean delegation. As is known at the international level, the 27th of February's earthquake gave us a number of experiences, and the armed forces in Chile gave historic support to the civilian population and to the community. That's part of the general response, and today we're working on disaster risk reduction, of course, and we're working on preparation for disasters. The contribution made by national defense authorities to civilian protection in Chile is a reality. Nowadays, the armed forces don't only work on responses. We're looking at the national platform for disaster risk reduction as well. So we're involved in all different aspects of the process, and we're looking at future challenges. We're also, as you have mentioned, looking at specific areas. We're developing programs that involve training and planning for disaster risk reduction in schools, in training centers, in training areas in general. We're all working in a coordinated fashion. The civilian and military areas are converging on this. So we've been working on a number of specific events which have taken place, and we've got this ongoing cooperation between the military and the civilian population. And we're very pleased with this because we can see that many of the countries which are around the Pacific face particular risks, and we need to be increasingly coordinated, and we need to contribute to the efforts. The armed forces have a great deal of capacity to assist with this, and we're glad to be able to help. So I'd like to mention this to the community here. I'd like us to think about how this military contribution is perceived. That's a pending issue in our eyes, and we think that this is an integral part of the reality which we currently face. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for raising that. It's a huge capacity of many countries, so let's see if there are any further reactions to that today or tomorrow. And now I'd like to invite...
Man with the blue shirt, blue tie.
Yes, blue tie?
Yep, he's raising.
Who's got the blue tie?
Yes. he asked about a half hour ago.
Thank you.
Okay,
I hope it's
please,
me.
There you are.
Hyogo, I work for the Norwegian Climate Adaptation Program under the Directorate for Civil Protection. And in that you can hear that we are covering both the issues of adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And I think this gives us a very good opportunity to see how to integrate these two with each other. Indeed, I agree with what Mr. Gerard said, that decision-making needs to be based on science, but I think the picture is a bit more nuanced. We need to be aware of what level of planning are we dealing with, and what are the needs for science at that particular level. And I would like to share with you some experiences from a pilot project that we are running for 5 municipalities in northern Norway on use of climate services in their planning. We are often talking about planning at different levels. In fora like this, we are talking about local, national, and international level, but also at local level, there are different levels of planning. And the results so far from that project is that you don't really need very detailed climate projections in order to plan the more overall general plans for society that covers across many sectors and so on. It's when you go to the more specific area or zoning plans, or you're going to do some building constructions and so on, that is when you need more specific climate projections, especially if you're planning for something to last for a long time. But then also comes the issue of uncertainties, and we are all aware that climate projections become more uncertain the more you downscale them. So of course there is a mismatch between what science can offer when you go down to such a detailed level of planning. But there is also the issue that, well, sometimes we hear that, well, if we just wait, maybe the models will be more precise, more exact in the future. The reality is that as climate models become more and more complex, they also become more and more uncertain because more elements are brought into them, and this increases the uncertainty. So a few years ago, we could estimate, for example, sea level rise to be within a certain well, we expected to sea level rise to be between two certain levels some years ago, but now we see that the gap between the probable levels are a lot higher. So there's also the problem associated with that. So what we see that you can do, and I think this is where the DRR comes in, is to supplement this knowledge with, well, past experiences, local knowledge, knowledge about institutional frameworks, legal frameworks, etc. And I think that this is something that the HFA2 can address, and probably also close this gap between what science can provide and what knowledge we need for planning, so that integrating adaptation is not only about a matter of climate projections, but also this more nuanced picture on which level to use it for, and to make use of tools, methodologies, strategies for planning that are already essential parts of DRR. I hope that captured my message. Thank you.
Thank you for, I think, these very thoughtful and insightful suggestions. I think, Arman, you also wanted to have the floor, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Please allow Norway's MFA to throw in a few words also in this discussion. First of all, I would like to compliment you and ISDR for this process. It's been very extensive. And I think that the document that comes out, as you said, Madam Chair, will be based on HFA1, if we can call it that, but then build on and respond to the future challenges, because often we are responding, we are trying to make schemes to solve yesterday's problems. Yesterday's problems cannot be solved. We are living with the consequences of them not being solved. We have to address the future. And I think one strong aspect of this HFA2 will be, I think, what we have seen in the process, the issue of partnerships will come out much stronger. And I think that the session that you organized so brilliantly with Lisa Doucet from BBC this morning in the plenary shows business in the center of things. And I have been thinking, for so long we have been working on governments like my own, because we have seen DRR as an expense on today's or this year's budget. We haven't seen it as an investment in the future. And as longer you postpone those investments, the one thing you can be certain of is the end bill will be higher and more difficult to cope with. Since governments have not been able to lead in the way that I think we should have, maybe business will. And I think that's something that's come out of this session compared to the one in 2011. The voice of business is right in the center of things. And as they say in America, money talks. And I think on this issue of DRR, money will talk, because the losses that Lisa drew up for us are just staggering. Another thing that we would like maybe to highlight, and going back to the ambassadors meeting here in Geneva on the 2nd of May and the excellent thoughts and ideas that came out of that consultation organized by Switzerland, and we can adhere to all of them. But it's also this issue of post-2015 being a holistic process, that we are not creating all these separate tracks which may not be working along the same goals, if you will. And I need to mention the issue of climate change. We organized yesterday with you and ISDR this event to exactly bring out this issue, that the climate must be into the HFA2, and also the DRR must be into the climate negotiations, because otherwise we are standing still, we are not making progress. I also want to raise this issue of local government and civil society, and the need for the actions to be grounded and owned where it really hurts, where the people live. And those of you who attended the session that we organized yesterday, I think will remember Madeleine Helmer from the IFCR. The passionate appeal she brought out, unless you touch and affect the lives of the people who are living in the small villages or feeling this every single day, then what we do may be many things, but it's not sustainable. Finally, I would also like to say that when we discussed the chair's summary last year, and I'm happy that we will see it earlier this year, so we all have a chance tomorrow maybe to bring in our thoughts and make some improvement maybe on the document, is that we brought out the issue of gender and youth. And HFA2 is for the future. So the children and youth must be right there. And I think the event organized tomorrow afternoon, you know, by UNICEF and Plan International and World Vision International and other actors will be very important, and I hope that you will give the proper reflection of those ideas, both in the process as we go forward with HFA2, but also in the chair's summary, because HFA2 is a document to address the challenges of the future, and that's why we want to raise that flag this early in our discussion of the children and youth. And thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I think there is a gentleman from Emmercom? No. Yes, please, go ahead. Yes.
Me?
You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. My name is Montien Buntan, and I'm a member of the Senate, the Royal Thai Parliament, and also member of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'd like to voice my opinion that the HFA2 should take into serious consideration the concept of social inclusion and human rights aspects. Particularly, it should address, recognize, and focus on active, full and effective participation by those who have been disproportionately affected by disasters. And these people have always been regarded as vulnerable groups, leaving them behind and not participating in a more positive and contributing manner. So by including them in a more active role, in good partnership with the whole society, the society will benefit from including these people. Now, I'd like to name those who have always been hit hard and disproportionately affected. Those could include the persons with disabilities, those children, the elderly, minority, linguistic minority groups, and also indigenous people. I also would like to stress the positive contribution, especially from the disability community, that could enhance greater enabling environment, and that also therefore create resilient community. And that's a concept of so-called universal design, which has been proudly presented by the disability community. I heard from this morning the comment from several key speakers saying that we should design the resilient infrastructure. So by incorporating the concept of universal design, which could be usable, accessible, and friendly to all people, we therefore enhance the capacity of the whole community to benefit. And that is from the disability contribution. Second, I'd like to focus on the knowledge sharing, which should be at the global sharing of knowledge. And it's about the knowledge that will empower individuals, communities, to act wisely when it comes to DRR. And this could be done through also the use of technology. And I don't mean only expensive technology. It's a technology based on the concept of accessibility for all. And that could be also achieved through universal design and the use of assistive technologies that follow the internationally standards of accessibility. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson.
Good. Thank you very much. I appreciate the definition of the resilient infrastructure as being usable, accessible, and friendly. I think that's a very practical way of seeing infrastructure. Now I'd like to invite the speaker from Emmercom, please. The floor is yours. And then I will go here and I will bite them off, yes.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Distinguished colleagues, I would like to go back to the subject of our meeting as announced, the new stage of the program. Obviously, it must keep the priority areas which were already mentioned, but also take into account new phenomena which have come about in recent years, technological and other such risks. Information integration, monitoring, forecasting, and other communication structures, management, integration of management, and the achievement of competency in management. Of course, all these extreme phenomena of climate change should be included among the social and economic development of each country, and there should be integration there. The next comment I wanted to make, which might be relevant, is the question of transboundary transmission. And this includes issues of developing migrations of industry and the consequences of all kinds of negative phenomena affecting not only states, who are the authors of these technological phenomena, but there are new diseases which were unknown in the past. And I think we need to stimulate national policies and international ones to fight this kind of transboundary transmission. And I also want to talk about something which is going to stay on the agenda for many, many years. That is the formation of a mass culture of safety as an element of the international culture. That is, we need to have as much influence as possible to ensure that to ensure safety for our environment, the house, the home, our city, our country, so that every citizen can live in as safe surrounding as possible. We need publicity, and that must enable society to do what needs to be done. And there's something else, which is the training of experts, particularly regarding technological threats, and also concerning the dissemination of information. And each of these technologies needs to be ready, and society needs to be ready for them, and so that there needs to be planning. And also, local leaders need to be properly changed, as should others. And we need to give attention to ensuring that their activity is as effective as possible for society. Now then, there are regional organizations, other organizations which we think could stimulate scientific work and educational technology. And the world must make use of one and the same terms and technologies so that we understand each other as far as safety is concerned. We need interaction and not just political statements. We need to be able to deal with risks, and we need to create statistics from country to country and have standards for a legal basis so that our actions are as appropriate and effective as possible. Thank you.
For all of you who are on this side waiting, I will give attention to colleagues here, but I promise we'll come back over here. So we start with Chile. You have the floor, please, and then we'll work our ways over here. Okay. Please, you have the floor, sir.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much,
Señora Margarita Stronstrom.
Chairwoman.
Quiero primero agradecer.
I'd like, first of all, to utter a word of thanks. My country has been involved in designing the plan which we're currently thinking about on a political level, I would say, together.
desde la perspectiva del sistema multilateral,
in terms of the multilateral system, which is what we're trying to embrace here, I think that this is the most significant message which we can give to the United Nations. I have a few short points to explain what I mean by that. I say that firstly because what we've been saying here in Geneva comes from the multi-dimensional aspect of this issue of disaster risk reduction. It's not only a humanitarian issue, it's also an issue relating to actors, players in the public and private sectors, and that's where the idea of this partnership came from. That's the first thing. Secondly, this is a topic which relates to development. We're talking about development here. And because of that, the main challenge here is to issue a clear message that the development issue should be built into the post-2015 plan. And that's not an easy process. I spoke to Marina Mohamed, the representative of the Secretary General, last week, and she was saying that there are many different facets to the process, the work, and this organization. But what we need to do is bring all of that together. And from this morning's ministerial meeting, we heard that we need to have a holistic approach. We need this development strategy on the part of the United Nations, and we need to recognize that this is a political issue. Thirdly, two things are required. First of all, institutions, an operational, functional type of multilateralism. And you, madam, have made an excellent contribution to ensuring that that multilateralism, this institutional framework, might work. But it's not enough for institutions to work. Institutions, in order to have good governance, need budgets, they need resources. And the message should, of course, include that. Fourth point, the role of investment. Investment isn't just something that belongs to the public sector, it's a pivotal aspect of social responsibility in relation to this topic. And when I say social responsibility, I'm talking, of course, about the private sector. This morning there was a very interesting session and an interesting line of thought about the role of the private sector. A number of speakers mentioned how investment can lead to greater risks if it isn't directed appropriately. And the role and the responsibility of the private sector are both pivotal issues. That was my fourth point. Fifthly, another crucial issue for the multilateral process is education and prevention. We need to educate in resilience. We need to train society, all aspects of society, government, local authorities, the community. And in this regard, Chile has a platform. We have a parliamentary framework, a local framework. We have the defense involved. And that's because we think that there's a social issue here and it has to be addressed from that perspective. Finally, what I want to say is that our main challenge here, and I say this to you because you have the technical authority but also the political and ethical responsibility to do this, is that we need to call for the political message which we need in 2015 to have development, partnerships, public-private responsibility at its core, and we need to recognize that this isn't just about humanitarian assistance. ECOSOC, which will be held this year in Geneva, will be a new opportunity to recognize that, but there's also going to be the high-level debate in New York, and that too will be an opportunity to build on this so that we can continue to meet the needs of our societies and resolve people's problems. I'm committed to that. And I will ensure that my president will take that message to New York. That's an ethical responsibility, it's a political responsibility, and that's why we're all here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that I think very clear and strong message, and we'll certainly continue to work together on that. A few of you have been waiting for a long time here, so I think the gentleman at the back there, there's a lady and then there's a gentleman, so we start with the gentleman. Yes, you can start, and then behind you there is a second gentleman to the left.
Thank you very much. I'm from Cuba. As is quite clear for all of us, it's been important to strengthen capacities. But we'd like briefly now to talk more specifically about what's expected of the post-2015 plan. We think we should move from asking what to asking how. So how can we have a corpus of procedures, standard-setting procedures, and go beyond just asking what we're going to do? In specific terms, one question we could ask is how we can materialize something which we know is a need and integrate the issue of disaster risk reduction and climate change into the development agendas of our countries. I'm going to talk about how we're doing that in Cuba. Variants of this can be found elsewhere in the Caribbean. Cuba, like most Caribbean countries and most Central American countries indeed, is threatened at a very high level by the consequences of climate change, global warming. In recent years, we've been battered by 8 serious hurricanes. The average rainfall has fallen by more than 130 milliliters. Droughts are becoming more severe and more extensive. And so my country has been obliged to look at models, test scenarios for future developments in climate change 2050, 2100, how this will develop. And we think that we need to issue a very clear message here to the legal frameworks of our countries. We need to look at these models and see what each body in the country should do. I've got a couple of very simple examples of this. Firstly, we've developed methodologies to look at disaster reduction in 168 communities in Cuba. We've looked at the risk which each citizen might be facing by the rising seas, hurricanes and so on. So we know what might happen in those cases. We also know that how each municipality will be affected by droughts, by desertification, by various different meteorological phenomena. And the laws have been brought in line with that. We've also been offering funding for these issues. So for each municipality, the meteorological factors are taken into account and all the different models are taken into account. The outcomes of the risk studies and the outcomes of the models. This is an interinstitutional issue which each different body has to fit into. So we can transfer water from areas of high rainfall and low rainfall, for instance. We can look at how different species are affected. And all of these different strategies have to be married together. And at the institutional level, we have to respond to the needs of agriculture and so on. And it's quite clear that different roles have to be established. I could go on with many other different examples, but time's limited, of course. All I'm saying here is that we have to transmit this message. We need to think about the how rather than just the what. And we believe that there has to be a set of procedures to respond to all of these issues. None of these have to be binding necessarily, but it's very useful to see what's done in other countries.
Thank you so much for that example from Cuba. And I go to the gentleman behind you there. Yes, you've been waiting a long time to get our attention, and then the lady just in front of you.
Thank you very much. I come from Kenya, and I work with Christian Aid, and I just wanted to share a few of the issues which I think would need to also be really taken forward. Some of them have been mentioned, but I will just need to reiterate that one of the critical areas of weaknesses which we have seen in the past, especially in the field in countries like even Kenya and also the Horn of Africa, is the issue of political commitments in terms of driving the agenda of risk reduction. Even when you check examples like the platforms that are in the countries, the people who come, the government officials that come into those places don't have decision-making power, for example. So you find the agenda ends up getting lost. So in terms of the HFA2, how do we ensure that the agenda for risk reduction, climate change adaptation is high up there with where decisions are being made as opposed to the current structure? Secondly, it has been mentioned here, the issue about the silo programming, the issue about the fact that we are doing these things differently, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation. But the reality out there is that budgets and funding are silo-based as we speak. So even when you want to integrate, you'll find that the funding mechanism, the global funding mechanisms for organizations, for even the UN, I think, are still silo-based. So how do you break that barrier? And I think there need to be a lobbying, especially within the UN system, in terms of having an integrated way, I don't know how, but an integrated way in terms of funding this integration agenda. The other thing which I wanted to mention about the HFA2 is having specific measurable outcomes that can be taken forward at a practical level, especially when it comes to even communities, when it comes to governments and all that. Because in the past there has been more the general commitments and all that. So how do we break it down into specifics? I'll give an example of what we have done, especially at Christian Aid, with some of the, like the meteorological department in Kenya, trying to use from the level of the regional forecasting at ISPAC, for example, the IGAD Climate Prediction Center, downscaling the information to the national and also later on downscaling the same to local community so that they can use the weather data, for example, so that you end up with a situation where you can make this information usable at the very, very local level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to pick up on one thing that you mentioned and ask all of you to reflect on it. I think your point that we need an intensive lobbying to merge the financial mechanisms at international level. But we are lobbying for so many things. So the noise level is very high. So if we can focus on a few issues, and maybe this can be one, maybe then things could change. But there are lots of recommendations in the air. So I just want to leave that with you to get some more feedback on that. And then I'm told that Lebanon is leaving unless they get a chance to speak. Oh. No, that's not what they say. They say, we'll have to leave. Could we make a comment before we leave? So you can, please.
Thank you, Margareta. Actually, I have a meeting now. That's why I would like to say a few comments about Hyogo Framework. Actually, I have 4 big titles that I would like to concentrate on regarding the HFA2. Basically, I'm concerned about the community resilience, how to overcome progress barriers, basically, in terms of financial resources. This is one of issues, legislation, and the empowerment of local government. And the third issue is I'm really concerned about the post-crisis, basically loss management versus the rapid recovery. No one can estimate ahead of time the losses. So basically, we don't have an issue related to this part, is not yet mentioned. And the last point that is really also a concern is the governance and project continuity, which is really need to set up really the high-level governance regarding this project. I'm sorry, it's short, but this is what I would like to say.
Can you maybe elaborate on how to overcome barriers to progress?
Yeah, basically I believe they have 3 dimensions. We need to build financial strategies. This is one of the issues. We need to have legislations, which is related to empowering local government or incentives, for example, financial incentives, if they have provided some measures to reduce disaster risk, so we can have financial incentives. And also we can have preparedness is one of the way to really overcome barriers. Okay.
Thank you so much, and please come back tomorrow and continue to explain to us what you would like to suggest. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
And now I'll go back to this side. Yes, please. Now it's your turn. Go ahead, young lady. Yeah, I think so.
Gracias. Jessy Cotto del Ministerio
Thank you. I'm from the Foreign Investment Ministry and Ministry for International Cooperation in Cuba. We'd like firstly to congratulate everyone for the progress which has been made concerning risk reduction in many different countries. However, in spite of that, we're here because there's still some work to be done. We're here, of course, because we intend to continue working on risk reduction. The HFA, which we want to establish for 2015, should, we think, respect the initial commitments which were made in Hyogo, and those commitments haven't always been respected. We'd also like the results which we desire and the breaching of the gaps which we hope to achieve should be worked on by the international organizations through better development. And unless we improve our technologies, we think that will be very difficult to achieve for developing countries. the mitigation of climate change, which mainly relates to pollution, is a massive issue in this regard. And another key issue is public policies, national plans and policies. Countries and governments need to include disaster risk reduction in all of those. And they need to be committed to disaster risk reduction in their countries. All of that has to involve a very multidisciplinary commitment, namely that all of the institutions in each country be involved. Any institution at the governmental or local level which is relevant has to be involved in this effort.
Thank you very much for that. And I think, yes, please. And after that, we'll go out. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Príjemné popoludne, dámy a páni. So don't be afraid, the speech will be delivered in English, not in Slovak language. I will be speaking on behalf of my colleague who represents the Slovak Republic. I would like to draw your attention to the results of our research work, which highlight the area still very much neglected. In Slovakia, we have been dealing for many years with the problems of floods and droughts and with the mitigation of corresponding risks. We came to the following conclusions. We use too much the term climate changes. Actually, climate changes we cannot blame the climate change for droughts, drying out of soil and streams, lowering of rivers and groundwater levels. Rather, the real culprits are the three phenomena which keep on spreading quickly in the earth. It's the compressed surfaces in the forest areas, man-made slopes, and draining ditches, which cause quick outflow of water from mountains to lowlands. All these phenomena contribute to the draining of lands, thanks to which the sun heats up the soil, which consequently heats up the atmosphere. These three phenomena influence climate change dramatically, and we can provide evidence in our documentary film, and Slovakia is ready to discuss this topic with you in the marketplace on Thursday during our presentation on the Ignite stage in the morning at 9:45. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And then I'll go to the extreme there, and after that I'll ask Mr. Charot to take the floor because he needs to leave at 5 o'clock. So if we want to hear more about the weather, we should do it now. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My name is Odile Bulton. I work for UNICEF in Niger. I would like to build up on a comment that the colleague from Christian Aid made earlier. The reason is that we are coming to a close in terms of HFA, moving towards HFA 2 within 2 years. And I'm wondering whether we could raise to the challenge of using that time frame to push cross-regional collaboration. We know that many countries are not up to speed for various reasons, financial, human resources, institutions, various contexts. And I'm thinking that a lot of the countries in some of the regions have made very much, have advanced. And those experiences and lessons learned could be transferred or at least shared across regions. And I'm thinking in particular in Southern Africa, where I worked recently, and I'm talking about Mozambique, Madagascar, and Comoros, who are countries that have made tremendous progress in trying to master DRR and climate change adaptation. These experiences could be, whether through visits through countries, and it's already happening in some cases, these cross exchanges could be done, and I'm thinking with West Africa in particular. The Sahel region, because there are lessons that have been learned from the Horn and other regions that could be transferred so that countries that are not up to speed could actually accelerate their level of implementation of HFA. and therefore move forward for HFA 2. The colleague from Christian Aid mentioned something that is very important. It's about the use of climate information for programming. We've done that with SADC in Southern Africa, and we have seen that in terms of preparedness, the impact is very, very great. Using those models in terms of, even if the accuracy is minimal, but going down to the national levels, the meteorological systems and institutions, and then to communities, and it has helped a lot. So I think that we have a lot here that is floating that we can harness and really push for the South-South exchange so that regions and countries do move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like Michel to share with you what he has heard, but also maybe some comment specifically on the area of expertise.
Thank you, Margareta, and my apologies in advance for having to leave you, but I'm splitting my time between this very, very important meeting, and we have at the same time a meeting of our Executive Council, the WMO Executive Council. So I will not attempt to summarize, first of all, because your discussion is not finished. My co-chair will do that, I'm sure, in a very effective way. But I would like to maybe make 3 remarks at this stage. First of all, what I've heard so far is definitely very encouraging. Definitely, it is addressing the purpose of this meeting. We have heard lots of very interesting points coming from different perspectives, regional perspective, different sector perspective, and that will help us very much to do better for and to refine for the next steps. And I'm sure it has helped you to hear from each other, to learn from each other about best practices. And that leads me to a very provocative statement I wish to make. It's not the first time I'm making this statement, but I want to make it again. Normally, in this kind of meeting, we hear a lot about best practice, what has worked. What is sometimes even more interesting is to hear about worst practice. I know it's difficult, it's challenging, but sometimes it's very informative to share experience about what has not worked so that the others don't do the same mistake. It is I know it's not very sexy, it's not very attractive to talk about that. I'm by background a scientist, and when we write scientific papers in the scientific literature, we much prefer to write something about successes than about failures. However, failures are also very, very informative, and they can be presented in a constructive way. I don't have a good solution to offer to you, but think about it. It would be good to find a way that we share also about what has not worked. My second remark is based on what several of you have mentioned, and maybe most explicitly by the Kenyan, our Kenyan colleague, about the financing. And the financing and trying to find out how can we convince those who can support it to finance that. It is a very important point, and because of many reasons, in many countries the financial situation is very difficult, and we have to convince people to put money in something which may happen this year, which may happen in 2 years, which may happen in 10 years, or actually which may not happen in the next 100 years. So it is, and at the same time, they are right now in front of our eyes very important priorities. So it is a challenging issue, but still we know it's a good investment. But how can we manage that in the context of multiple top #1 priorities? And something which has not been very much discussed here, and maybe it will be discussed in other session, is also the question of risk transfers, about finding also, trying to use some other financial mechanism. But there's quite a range of mechanisms which indeed can be used for that. But it is indeed a very challenging issue. My third comment is, well, no, sorry, I want to add one point on the previous one as well. The previous, on the financing, and it is indeed a big challenge when we talk also about climate change. When we talk about climate change, why should we invest now, or some people say not invest, but spend money now for benefit which will be for the future generations? And there is sometimes the hope that, okay, let's hope that it will not happen in the next 4 or 5 years, but this is where also civil society, you can help very much by putting the pressure, because most people care about not only themselves, of course, but they care about their children, they care about their grandchildren. And this helps to bridge the gap between the traditional decision-making, which is a sort of short-term decision-making when it comes to finance, and the longer-term horizon, which is what we need for this planet. Now, my final comment will be much more technical, and it will relate to the very last intervention from Niger. And for that one, you mentioned the benefit, and I was very happy, of course, to hear that the benefit of this seasonal and climate information for decision-making, although the level of skill, you are quite right, is not huge, but there is skill, and the way we are doing that, actually, we are most advanced in Africa for doing that. And we have mapped our action on the sub-regional economic groupings of Africa. So for the SADC, for the IGAD countries, and so on, we organize once or twice a year what we call regional climate outlook forums. What is it? It is we get the experts from the region, local experts from all the countries in the region, and they have access to all the possible information from anywhere on the planet, from the best centers in the planet, satellite information, modeling information, every information, and they get together and they elaborate a consensus forecast which is in forms of probabilities for the next seasons. Key parameters, of course, are with respect to the next rainy season. When will the rainy season start? Will be longer, shorter than usual, will be more intense, less intense than usual. And it is present in forms of probability, and this is indeed used for many applications. It is used by the farmers, it is used by the energy producers, it is used in some countries by the health sector to predict the probability of malaria treatments, meningitis, and it is used also by our UN partners such as the World Food Programme, the FAO, and many other partners, and by the non-UN partners such as the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and many, many others. So this is something we are doing right now on an ad hoc way, but as part of this initiative which I mentioned earlier, which is across the whole UN system, to develop a global framework for climate services, we want to spread that to the whole planet, and also to make sure that it's not done in an ad hoc base, but that you meaning all those who need to have this information, you can rely upon that and not just wonder, will it be available or not available? So, Margareta, let me stop here because indeed I have to escape, but let me thank you for inviting me, and let me thank all of you for the feedback. It will be certainly very, very valuable feedback, and although I'm leaving, my colleagues from WMO are still around, and we shall certainly take on board very much your input. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel, for being here these couple of hours. So we had a couple of more speakers, and 3, 4, 5 more, and see.
You're on this side now too.
Yes.
We have in the back, this gentleman, in the back.
Yep. You can start, please, and then we'll come here. Yes, and then we come to Japan. Please go ahead. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to be very brief. I'm Guillermo González. I'm from Nicaragua, and I'm involved in the National Disaster Prevention and Response Body. I think there's a great deal of convergence in this room, so I don't want to speak at length, but I would just like to contribute something from our experiences about this entire process. So I'd like to offer a number of ideas which we could bring into our current line of thinking. The first main experience which we've had in recent years is that speaking about risk reduction is a pressing matter, and it's a very important issue. We're talking here about what we're going to do in the post-2015 period, and it's very pressing for us in Nicaragua to talk about this in relation to development. Thinking about development, we have to add something to the word development, namely the word human development. Many speakers have mentioned problems relating to man-made disasters, and in many cases there's a lack of understanding about economic systems which contribute to the deterioration of the environment. So that's one thing. The second issue is that in our experience is proven crucial that we make populations the main actors in all the programs which we establish. This has been said today, and I'd like to echo that. We need to make human rights a cross-cutting issue in this line of work. And when we say human rights, we mean the people's right to be intimately involved in everything that's going on in the public sector. It's very important to mention that. It's very important to include many different actors in this work. And we should draw attention to the fact that that should be one of our areas of work for post-2015. Young people have for us been one of the main pillars of working on these issues, and they've formed the link between disaster risk reduction and the environment and climate change. Women have been crucial as well. Women have been pivotal in leading communities, and we think that we should stimulate that line of thinking to ensure that women are involved and that these programs are as successful as possible. A third aspect which we wanted to mention from our experience in recent years is the way in which we can achieve local alliances, in which national governments, local governments and communities come together in a very clear way to look at these problems and to participate in providing solutions to them. We think that that's part of the success which we could achieve in the post-2015 period. And finally, we'd like to mention another area. Many speakers have talked about having very specific plans which can be established and followed and monitored, a sort of intensive care unit for this patient which we have, the environment. This patient, which is our vulnerable set of populations, which is currently facing these environmental disasters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think your image of an intensive care unit is probably highly apt, so let's see if that can add a sense of urgency to this. Can I invite the next speaker, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Ridwan Jamaluddin from the delegation of Indonesia. During the last 2 hours or so, we have heard so many good suggestions, ideas, intervention, remarks. In preparing for the post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction, I would suggest that we should put more effort on preparing a more effective implementation plan. I believe the HFA1 has been successful in establishing the foundation, but now we need to move faster forward from commitment, agreement to implementation. In more detail, I would like to remind that Indonesia hosted the 5th AMCDRR last October, and the output has been stated in the so-called Yogyakarta Declaration. I would like to draw our attention in 2 points. First, that declaration put a lot of encouragement that local people, local community, local government need to be more effective, more powerful, more capable in tackling DRR. Second, at least during the last 2 days, we have heard a lot of enthusiasm from the private sector that they are willing to take part in disaster risk reduction. I think this is a very good sign. So for that, I also would like to ask everyone to put more effort in involving private sector in this DRR. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, please.
Je viens du Liban et ma réflexion
I'm from Lebanon,
est relative
and
au
what I'm
caractère
thinking
non
about
imposable,
has to do with the
le caractère non imposable du cadre de Hyogo
non-taxable
souligné par Madame la Présidente. Monsieur
aspects
Jarreau,
of the
il a dit qu'on peut plus
HFA.
séparer les
Mr.
trois
Jarreau
sphères
said
du
we
développement,
can't
du changement climatique et
separate
de la réduction des risques.
climate
Moi,
change,
je
risk
propose à réfléchir
reduction, and I
est-ce que la
think we
sphère
ought
de l'aide au
to
développement,
consider
on y
the
intègre les mesures de réduction des risques.
possibility of introducing risk reduction. Why do we not have things which are taxable at the time when we're establishing programs for developing countries? There are ways of measuring the efficiency of aid, and there's no reference to risk reduction. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam. I am Peniel Malakar from Emmanuel Hospital Association, India. While listening to various discussions across various sessions, I was actually wondering, when I go back, what do I take? And especially here, as I was sitting here and discussing about HFA2, would that be repetition of HFA1, which actually did not trickle down to the local community level that well? When I talk about my organization being a healthcare institution, how we got engaged to disaster management is basically seeing increasing number of disasters happening across our community that we work. 70% of our hospitals are in remote areas. I moved my profession from the hospital administrator to a disaster management professional in 2006. The reason is why I would like to say a few things about the HFA2 is that this is the right time probably to really let the HFA2 agenda reach to the grassroots level. I never knew what is HFA1. And even when I already spent about 2 to 3 years in responding to disasters, I never knew what was HFA1. And I think this is the challenge and should be the mandate from HFA2 to make sure that it reaches down to the lowest level. We talk about communities being the first responders. And I am very sure in a population 120 million in India, 99.999% will not know what is HFA. I was surprised myself when I first interacted with disaster management organizations in a network in Delhi. Many of them were blinking about HFA, and we had to expand it to tell them that this is a platform where the global level commitment was made to reduce risk of disasters. And before me, there are a few. I'm in continuation with my VFL communication. I would like to really state here that we need to empower the local community, local NGOs, local CSOs who are never heard. To come to such level, you need to have a very good backup of international organizations. Otherwise, you are not heard. You are not even found anywhere. To empower the local organizations, why not, I would like to give an analogy of manufacturer to the end user of a product. If we reduce the channel, I think the product reaches to the end at a lower cost. I think a huge amount of administrative and other costs is merged into the huge funding raised by UN. and many international organizations. I have the fancy of having international organizations as partners, traditional partners, to bring in funding to reach to the grassroots level. But I see many organizations struggles to do whatever good thing they are doing. And so empowering them by direct funding as a twin track approach, one could be continuation of funding through government agencies, but to avoid any conflict, why don't we have a common agenda drawn? The government agencies, organizations work up to the district level, which is very effective in India. They have district level and disaster management authorities right from the nodal NDMA. And they are doing very well up to the district level. Why don't we have the second approach, the United Nations or even international organizations approach the local communities? I was surprised to see the VFL survey done, picking up a handful of 11 organizations to give the views of 120 million people, and out of that 70% of people were suffering due to disasters and increasing frequencies of disasters. So reaching down to the bottom level is extremely important, madam, and HFA2 would be successful only when we really proactively work on a mechanism to reach to the lowest level. This is my only plea and request. Thank you. Thank you for giving me time.
Good, thank you so much. Yes, Professor, please, and then we'll go to I4C, and we have a couple of gentlemen there. Professor.
Okay, Jalal Darbik, Director of Urban Planning and Disaster Risk Reduction in Palestine. First of all, as we know, the DRR is a holistic approach. Knowing that to reduce the risk, we need to visualize the hazard, decreasing the vulnerability, and increase the coping capacities. This means we need to have the target group, citizens, professionals, and decision makers. Here, based on HFA1, we know that the main key elements are good governance and capacity buildings. Good governance, to consider that the disaster is a priority for the country. As I know, in many countries, they did it. Good governance, legislations, a lot of things. It's from the decision makers. And the capacity buildings will be oriented for professionals, engineers, planners, and so on. But finally, the results was very small. My opinion is for HFA2, we need a tool to bridge the gap between the good governance and the capacity buildings, because these two elements, very important elements, and this means that we need capacity buildings for decision makers, because it's not enough to sign, it's not enough to declare. Our problem with them is how to link, how to fastening the relation between professionals and decision makers. Second, something which also is important, the media. According to maybe in Palestine, this special case, because we have good experience with the media should be involved. And I know that in HFA, priority number 3, the media, there is a place for the media. But I think the media can play a very important role should play a very important role in HFA2. Maybe we need something to be specific for this kind of tool, because it's a very important tool in our mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. IFRC, please, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for giving IFRC the floor for the second time. Maybe few comments on your two specific questions. Does the synthesis report provide enough directions? And number 2, what are the gaps? And what are the most important interventions that they can make impact in the next 4 years? I think many colleagues have been mentioning about the possibilities of improving the HFA2 and including building HFA1. And we just wanted to add our views that HFA1 help us a lot in Red Cross, Red Crescent to improve and to progress and to integrate disaster risk reduction at the community level. We think one of the gaps, and it has been mentioned by our colleague from India, I think in the HFA2 we need to provide some resources and time to take the implementation down to national level and community level. I think the HFA 1 or 2, there will be very good guidance and directions, but they need to be taken into context specific. They need to be translated into specific, for the specific types of risk. And this is where we think all the national DRR platforms and the national government, they should have a plan, integrated plans, to lead and help organizations like Red Cross, Red Crescent, to push with them in the same direction. So we think there should be provision of resources and times to translate HFA2 into specific plans, especially with the second point about the impact during next 4 years. In our own evidence, what we have been collecting as Red Cross, Red Crescent, we think there are two related interventions that can make big impact and quick impact in terms of reducing risk and disasters. One of them is public education in schools and outside the schools. We have an experience of working in 50 countries, and we're happy to share that. And we think that is a cost-effective, lasting impact, and children can help spreading the culture of safety and resilience as broad as possible. The second area, what the Secretary General of WMO has been repeating, and we have been very good part of that, the community early warning systems. I think there is a lot of information available about predictable risk coming from the climate that need to be simplified and spread and disseminated. We think unless we make that scientific information as a public good, still there are a lot of risks that we cannot handle. And we think there are predictable risk and unpredictable risk. But I think at least for the predictable risk, we need to establish solid community early warning system to be part of all programs we implement. Whether they are sectoral programs, whether they are national programs, we think that information has to be made for the public. Very quickly, Madam Chair, on integration of DRR and climate change, we have implementation of programs in over 70 countries trying to integrate DRR and climate change adaptations. We have a global guidance for Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies, and people can pick up copies in our booth number 6, and that tell national societies how could we be risk informed and climate smart in designing emergency operations, recovery, and development programs. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maximilian Witting from United Nations University Institute of Environment and Human Security. I was following the discussion, and it's a very enlightening discussion, and I just wanted to raise one fact which has not yet been mentioned during the discussion. It affects the HFA priority 4, reducing the underlying risk factors, which has been identified as the one of the most significant priorities, which has the last progress or the least progress during this, the last years. And we should think about how to integrate these issues of understanding and addressing underlying risk factors and drivers of vulnerable conditions into the HFA2 framework and progress. And it is very important that we consider the actual roots of the visible conditions and vulnerabilities in order to sustainably reduce the risk situation. This includes to think about potential strategies, how to address roots and drivers of the disasters in order to prevent that disasters do not occur in the same manner as they might have occurred before. This also considers or includes sensitive factors such as low level of commitment and awareness of governmental agencies, inclusion of the low level of local inclusion, but also certain political and power structures, and also cultural issues which influence the vulnerable and risk situation. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Now I'll go back to this. I apologize for sometimes there are misunderstandings who is now, but it's your turn now. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My name is Alamek Abrahams. I'm a member of the Kenyan delegation. Basically, I would like to state that a lot has been said about DRR as a holistic matter. I want to also state that the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction has done a great deal of work in terms of bringing nations together, not just stakeholders, nations together. Therefore, at this point in time, allow me to say that it would be important for us to appreciate where we're coming from, that we have an agency which has found it necessary to bring us together to share our own experiences. So apart from the good practices we are told, we also need to address challenges. Let us not look at our challenges as failures. Let us consider our challenges possibly as a drawback that is a setup for a comeback. And that way we'll be able to progress. With all that in mind, therefore, what is ailing implementation of DRR at the grassroots? From my personal experience, I would like to say that maybe it's something that is, my experience could be a replica of what's happening elsewhere. That lack of political goodwill. This one comes to us as a big challenge as practitioners in the humanitarian sector. That one disaster that we have not looked at means and ways of reducing its risks is this hazard known as the politician across the countries. We need to design ways in which we can ensure that political entities, political personalities in various countries are held accountable globally for any hazards, be it human disaster or otherwise, so that nobody will take the issues of DRR for granted. But as long as it is a field day whereby whether I implement the Hyogo Framework or not, I'm not held accountable to anything. It's very important at this point that we try and look for means and ways of ensuring that whatever we discuss here maybe is put in a way, it is packaged such that it can make people become accountable. As we proceed, I was also saying that let us not blame ourselves so much. In Kenya, we have a saying, it is attributed to the Japanese, but I believe we have Japanese delegation. I hope I'm not wrong when I quote what we purport they say, that 1,000 miles walk begins with one step. I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but please don't give me an answer. I want to believe that at this point, we are more than 100 miles, though we are targeting 1,000 miles. So we are not doing so bad. And when I go back to what has actually happened in Kenya, until some few years ago when we encountered a terrorist attack in the capital city of Nairobi, we did not have any policies that were related to disaster management. But as I'm talking today, we've come a long way, but we have a policy that is going to be authorized through executive orders by the current president of the Republic of Kenya to make it into a law. We have walked a long way with it. Because of that, even in the absence of a policy document, you find that the government went ahead and created a whole ministry for special programs, which had a mandate of coordinating all disaster-related activities. That was basically the role of the Ministry of State for Special Programs. And under that one, I'll just give you a structure maybe for a minute. We came up with the national platform for DRR, which brings on board various professionals. Under the national platform, we have the sector working groups. So if you look at it, we have the water sector, for example, we have the agricultural sector, we have the health sector, and so on and so forth. We have included most of the UN agencies are on board, both local and international NGOs are on board. So there is nothing that we are doing with exclusivity. We have ensured that we've brought everybody on board. And as a result of that, we have a number of programs that we can cite as success stories. Sometimes back you could hear about floods, perennial floods in the western part of the country. But today, it has been minimized a bit, whereby we have dikes and we even installed community radio stations which were actually broadcasting in the vernacular to warn people about impending floods. So that way we have been able to achieve quite a number of things. Finally, it's not a very good saying, but still it is known. They say that you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. Basically, we are talking about human beings. They are not dogs in this forum. But we realized that if you want to have effective change, start with the children. So as we are talking right now, Kenya, we are developing through the Ministry of Education a disaster risk management curriculum from the primary, that is the lowest level of education institution, to the tertiary level. We already have about 4 universities that are offering degree courses in disaster management. I believe it's just a matter of time, and we might not talk about the sky being the limit. Of course, we have limitations, but by and by we shall be able to overcome. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Can I encourage others also to share bad practices if you want, but things that did not work, and that will be very helpful, I think, for us to move forward. We'll come back to you. I just want to invite Melissa, who is sitting at the very far left of the room.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Melissa Lindros. I'm from Child Fund International, an international alliance serving children and their well-being around the world. I would like to support what has been expressed by representatives from Norway, Algeria, Kenya, and Nicaragua on the catalytic role of youth and children in the HFA2 process and in DRR at large, and the importance of education expressed by the co-chair, which was the first priority expressed by children in the Children's Charter. I would also like to express gratitude to the ISDR for yet again providing a remarkable forum for open discussion and planning and the formal integration of children and youth in this process. Would like to highlight just a couple issues. They're not new issues, but I think they're important for HFA2. The increased investment in DRR priorities set about in HFA1 by donors and international NGOs, prioritization of DRR in the budget process at regional, national, and local levels, and the importance to remember the targets that we agreed upon from the previous chair's summaries. DRR would represent 1% of total development funding and 10% of large response funding. The continued strengthening of DRR mainstreaming into development policies and frameworks, and the accountability increasing around the integration into MDGs and the climate change agreement, and investment in local capacities to carry out this work. And again, on the issue of targets, in the HFA, as well as those agreed in the previous chair's summaries, the targets should be measurable, and we propose in HFA2 consideration be given to supportive mechanisms for strengthened accountability of political bodies and INGOs, international organizations, for accelerating implementation of agreed upon targets around children, youth, and safe schools, including the 2009 targets, which were agreed upon in the chair's summary. Dissemination of clear examples of good practice partnerships, continued prioritization and budgeting of child-focused and child-led DRR, and finally, directives for accelerated research and data collection with age and gender disaggregated data on the impacts of disasters on vulnerable groups, both at national and local levels, which will put, again, a human face on the DRR discussions for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for reminding us about the whole way of commitments that we have made. And we do have a little summary report, modest, in the it's an ISDR effort to try to pursue some of the commitments that were made in the previous chair summary, so you might find that interesting to take a look at. Now I'd like to give the floor back to Sopek.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring maybe an issue that hasn't been talked about very much so far, and that's science. I'm very surprised how few scientists are in the room, or if they are, they're very quiet, which sometimes they are. And going forward to HFA2, I think it's essential, if not imperative, that there is some way that the policy people here, and the people talking about laws, and the people talking about governance and all this sort of thing, can find a way to engage with scientists. Let's remember what scientists can provide. They can provide real information, they can provide real tools. They can actually work out a range of scenarios for a whole range of hazards, a whole range of risks. They can work out magnitude, expected impacts, and all this sort of thing. For example, I had to go to the Tongan government a few weeks ago and inform them that worst case scenario, they can be hit by a 10-meter tsunami with no more than 10-minute warning. And we had modeled that, we'd modeled the science of that. You can imagine that very funereal discussion, but actually it sort of shook them around a little bit, and maybe there'll be some action from that. Now, scientists themselves are trying, but you have to, I'm speaking as a, well, I was a practicing scientist, I'm not so much anymore. Scientists, you know, we have to deal with them as a different animal. They're not like policy people. They often don't see the things policy people see. And the other big thing I did some studies on recently was their performance indicators are quite different. You look at academic scientists, for example, what really makes them tick? It's pulling in money and grants and getting big publications so they'll get their professorship, okay? Now, working in development, scientists in development, they don't get those performance indicators. So somehow we have to help them. We have to help them transcend the narrow metrics that universities have and say, well, actually, you know, a little bit of your time can cause a huge impact, can really help us work if you work with us, but you've got to work with us as part of a team. So we did a study, for example, where we looked at, I actually worked quantitative matrices, where one side of the metrics was what really interests the scientists and researchers. We also looked at social scientists. Another bit of we've involved communities, was what involved the communities. And there was tremendous divergence with just a little bit of convergence. And although a lot of it was common sense, it was a lesson to me how much scientists fail to see the disconnect between their aspirations and ambitions and those of communities. And I don't think one can help the other until we get over that barrier. So maybe we can help them. They have their own fora. They have these meetings. One's called Cities on Volcanoes, for example, that I've attended a few times, that the UN is usually part of. But you know, Cities on Volcanoes is a classic scientific conference where they're looking at, from a scientific point of view, but also from social impact, how science can predict impacts on cities that live around volcanoes, such as in the Andes, such as in Central America, such as in the Pacific, such as in many places. Also, actually, they do talk about mistakes. We talk about mistakes a lot. So I'd like to actually, there's one publication if you're interested. It's written by the Geological Society of London. I was a little bit part of it. And it's called Communicating Geoscience. In fact, it's just called Communicating Geoscience. And one of the papers is by me, and actually part of that paper is a mistake that I and my team made quite a few years ago. We were working in a Pacific country, and we got this emergency, as scientists, we got this emergency asking us to go 1,000 miles to the other side of the country because they thought a volcano was starting to erupt. So we all got in a helicopter. We all went around the volcano on the helicopter. We landed on the island. We had an impromptu meeting with all of the 2,000 people, and we said, oh, don't worry, it doesn't look anything significant. We don't think it's a big deal. We got back in the helicopter and we left. Now, of course, everybody here can tell me what a stupid thing that was to do. But, and you'd say, oh, we would never do a thing like that. But actually, things like that happen a lot. And these things have been noted down and are listed, and we can learn from lessons learned. And that's just one crass error that we made, and there are many other small errors. Finally, there is a point that we're looking at in here. We're looking at using the wisdom of indigenous people. It's something I've worked on volcanoes, actually, particularly with indigenous people where the written word is not such a big deal. When you're working in places like China where you've got thousands of years of written history, it's not such a big deal. You can find a lot about disasters. But when you work in a lot of part of the world, like the Pacific, like parts of South America, etc., if you want to know the history of some of the disasters, you can't find them in books. They're not in records. They're not anywhere. So we've done studies of actually incorporating the customary wisdom of local communities. Some of it is relevant and some of it isn't, and you've got to use your discretion how. So that's a really good example of how communities and scientists can work together, and there are many other ways. So my plea to you is, please find a way to bridge the gap between policy making, between lots of talk, and scientists who actually produce stuff and can give you figures, probabilities, and uncertainties, without which a lot of the rest of the planning, quite frankly, is shooting in the sky. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much for this very strong message. As you know, this is it's also in this conference a subject of discussion, how to make science usable and how to increase the natural collaboration between science and policymakers. But as you just described, it's not so easy to say, and maybe sometimes we ask the wrong question in order to get an answer that is a more practical way forward. I don't know if there's any of the science network here in the group. You probably participated, but do let us hear from you if you have some thoughts you want to share. I'd like to give the floor to this gentleman at the far right. Yes, sir. Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead, yes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you.
Je voudrais intervenir sur un
Thank you.
aspect
I would like to make a comment about one aspect which I think could be
il n'y a pas que les maladies qui sont insidieuses, mais il y a aussi des risques qui sont insidieux.
We don't just have infectious diseases, we have infectious risks, and the risk which I want to talk about is the problems which often affect our cities and towns. In many countries, risks are considered to be minor, but in our countries and in many countries around the third world, there are risks which are very serious, and in the post-2015 HFA, we should really be taking these into account. I hope that in 2014, in the African Union, these risks relating to urbanization in particular can be taken into account. There are many concerns surrounding this in my country. There are concerns relating to rural areas as well, because people come from rural regions to bigger towns and cities for economic reasons, and this leads to a fairly chaotic situation, which then engenders a number of other risks, which result from the original one. Even when there are guidelines in relation to this, we experience difficulties in applying them, and in many of our cities and towns, those guidelines don't even exist in the first place. So these people move from rural areas to urban areas, and further risks are brought about. you'll no doubt understand that this only leads to a snowball effect with various incidents resulting at the social level, at the political level, and in terms of the health of the population. It'll come as no surprise as you to hear that this leads to many different problems, and it's important for the international community to offer assistance in this regard so that we can engage in a number of solution-finding efforts. That's particularly the case since there are shared stakes to be recognized in these fields. In terms of post-2015 action, this might be something which could help populations such as ours, countries such as ours, if they can regulate these issues and strive to combat the downside of urbanization. This will allow us to prevent future disasters, because we can often see the way in which disasters and problems arise. We have many different problems, and in many cases these problems are really quite tragic in their scale, so it would be useful for the international community to recognize that, look at it in closer detail, and consider the fact that for certain countries it's really quite a crucial issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. The gentleman with the same hair color as I have, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Hiroshi Kawamura, representing the DAISY Consortium. I would like to raise and draw your attention to the copyright issues when it comes to the provision of accessible disaster preparedness information, and also when it comes to the first response. The access to the published knowledge is essential. I really thank IPA, International Publishers Association, and some of the national libraries. When Japan was hit by a gigantic tsunami, they have released their online documentation to be used for the first response. That was very, very important support. The knowledge in this sense is really necessary to respond and prepare for disasters. When it comes to children and people with disabilities, people who are living with indigenous language or minority languages, copyright issues is also very important from both sides, because indigenous knowledge need to be published by their own language in their own culture. The publishing in indigenous format of language and culture should be promoted. But currently, those indigenous knowledge, once it is published in so-called industrialized countries, it is copyrighted. So then it's very difficult to be used in the indigenous community itself. So we need to think about the real exchange of knowledge on disaster risk reduction. So therefore, I would like to draw your attention to think about the copyright, some measures to be taken to allow, say for example, non-profit use of copyrighted materials for disaster risk reduction should be legalized without permission of the copyright owners or something like that. It could be a concept under fair use in some countries, but it is definitely an issue of ISDR to talk with WIPO. Just like the ITU has a Tampere Convention in their own territory of responsibility, WIPO should have some measures to release copyrighted materials for disaster risk reduction. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that, I think, excellent insight. We'll certainly pursue that with WIPO across the street. So we'll see if we succeed. So you have the floor, yes.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Soy Roberto
Thank you,
Delgado,
Chair. I
vengo
am
de
Roberto Delgado. I'm from Mexico, and I too work in a private sector university.
Hace un momento dar algún caso de éxito y no.
We've been thinking about successful and less successful cases, and so if you'll allow me, I'd like to say that for the past 10 years, we've been in Mexico establishing a national network of universities for disaster risk reduction and prevention, and we now have around 90 universities working in a coordinated manner across the country to try to prevent disasters. There's a successful side to this, and that is that in the worst disasters, we've managed to mount a very significant response from the private sector and also from the international sector, and that's allowed us to take action in Haiti beyond our own borders, where we had a funding campaign which garnered $2.5 million, and we also managed to establish schools, clinics and training centers in Haiti, and we managed to help existing ones. We also took action in relation to the Asian tsunami and constructed 2,000 dwellings in one place in Indonesia. That's the good side of our work. But the downside is that we've been unsuccessful in certain areas where fewer resources are perhaps required, and that is that we need support from international organizations for the building of infrastructure, and we believe that there can not be successful cities and countries even unless the people in them are successful, and we need to have funds being invested in the best areas, namely people themselves. It's much more difficult to rebuild individual lives than to rebuild cities and larger scale areas, and so we need to ensure that investment goes to those areas where it's really most successful, which is in prevention rather than reconstruction. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. We have another almost 15 minutes before we hit 6 o'clock, and I have 4 speakers on this side, and I think that's so there is a white paper in there. You can start with that, and then we'll come this way. Yes.
And the white paper is about science again. I thought was the gentleman from the United Kingdom was absolutely right. Science is very difficult to integrate because universities have their agenda and have their knowledge. I think what's needed here in the ISDR context is a dialogue between those asking the right questions and those providing the information. And this has to be established in a very well-structured way. We've seen it in the afternoon with Michel Charot and the WMO. There's a well-structured organization and the right questions are asked and answered there. For climate services, for example. No? If you look at risk management, it looks very different. The European Union makes their calls for Horizon 2020, and again, there's a structure. But this is missing on a global level, and this is missing for ISDR. Having the possibility to ask questions in the form of a call, and universities and science providers can answer these questions. One point I'd like to focus on is human sciences. Now, I come from metrology. I'm the national focal point from Austria. But we've seen the limits that science has if human sciences do not interact sufficiently. And if, for example, you try to get warning across to the users, you very quickly come to your limits as a metrologist to convey these warnings. And the last point are standards. I've seen somewhere beforehand that standards should not be too precise and should not obstruct the development of things. I think, of course, it's difficult to implement standards, and we had a program where we tried to standardize European weather warnings, and this was very difficult, and we had lots of throwbacks. But in the very end, we have to think from the user's point of view. The user is a citizen that lives in a very mobile world. whether it's migrant workers, whether it's tourists, we're all on the move. And if we encounter warning systems which change from one country to the other very much, then these warning systems, they might be as good as they are, but they still have very strong limits. So I think we should focus on that also, integrate human sciences in communication and getting the message across. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Please.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. I'm from the European Space Agency and the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites. Starting from one remark from Michel Jarraud during his opening statement, he mentioned the need to provide the information to the decision makers in order to better cope with disaster risk management. Taking also the example of used by Japan regarding the building of the infrastructure in the 60s, there was mentioning of these dams that maybe were not adapted anymore due to the observed fluctuations these days in rainfalls, etc. So there's a need to pass information to the decision maker. And I would say that a good information starts with the good observations. Looking at the data provider side, especially on the satellite side, I note that under the current HFA, space agencies have been not been solicited by the various stakeholders and user community in the RM. Though we have got petabytes of data for free over the last 40 years that can be made available, and we know that this data can be used by the scientific, by all communities of users to improve actions against disaster. So what we hope that like the previous speakers have mentioned, the need to establish a better dialogue between the scientific community and the decision maker and the various stakeholders. We hope that through the HFA2, they will be able to engage a dialogue all along the chain from the data providers up to the decision makers. And space agencies have created 2 years ago a working group on disaster to look at the measures we could undertake to facilitate the access to this data, physical access, but also acting on data policy to have more open data policy to offer these petabytes of data for free to all the people that can bring something to disaster risk management. Thank you, Mrs. Chair.
Thank you for that. You heard the message there about the change to ensure more free access and open data. And I also heard a commitment of scientists to be very present in the middle of HFA2. So we have can your comments maybe be quite, or your suggestions rather, be quite brief now, then we'll be able to cover the 5 remaining comments. So please, sir. Yes.
Horst Kremers, Berlin. I want to come back to your point, Roberta Wallström, when you said about what went wrong. We have to know more about what went wrong. Now, this is a matter of management, investigating in management. This is where we need to investigate in decision-making. And decision-making, of course, is depending on a lot of information. It's not only the petabyte of remote sensing, but there's a lot of bits and pieces put together. And I'm not aware that we have any kind of slight idea of how to put these complex information together like a Hurricane Katrina or whatsoever disaster, which is so complicated. Nevertheless, if we don't have this information, the scientists and the management people cannot really wrap up and learn from the old disaster, because it's learning not only the nature, but it's also learning to how decision-making has been. There always is alternatives in decision-making, and it's not clear if that can be retraced, and we need all that information. I don't want to call it science. Nevertheless, there is, in that complexity, there are so new methods that we need that certainly scientific aspects are important there too. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you for that. And then a young woman, I think, at the far end, please.
Thank you, Chair. The point that I'd like to draw is that it's important to give prominence to developing and supporting local mechanisms or platforms for DRR. And this is with respect to sharing of good practice, as well as to solicit support in respect of challenges or difficulties that may be encountered. Very often we have dialogue at a very high level, and what happens is that these dialogues dilute the experiences or practicalities that are experienced at local level. So in light of that, I think more emphasis needs to be put in terms of local mechanisms. Such mechanisms will help in terms of strengthening information and communication, which seems to be, there seems to be a dire need for this. Also, it will help in terms of the knowledge management issues around indigenous knowledge, and more importantly, in terms of having to develop and foster a repository of information. Experiences at local levels are not well documented, and for this reason, I think one needs to look at strengthening it so that more informed decisions and actions can be applicable. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. You have the floor, please. I'll come back to you, yes.
Oui. Professeur Guednechi, délégation algérienne.
I'm from the Algerian delegation. I'm a professor, and in terms of universities, I just want to say that in Algeria, the Directorate for Scientific Research and Technological Development is setting up a center for disaster risk reduction. In almost all universities in Algeria, we have a training in risk management, and as a university professor, I just wanted to mention that the risk issue is being dealt with all over Europe, for instance, and what might be useful for another session of this nature would be to have an experience exchanging workshop for results which have been garnered in the field, and that would allow us all to pool our ideas. Thank you.
Thank you for that practical proposal for next step. And then the final comment from gentleman with the yellow tie. Please, go ahead.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Chair.
Hay un tema, yo vengo de Colombia, soy el director de gestión de riesgo de este país.
And I manage
y algo de las
the risk management facility in that country. We've had a number of good and bad experiences. Colombia in 2010 and 2011 had a very serious flooding problem. It was the most serious problem of that nature that we'd had for 50 years. And we had to look at risk management for the present and the future times as a result of that. We had a historic level of investment as a result of the studies which were carried out, and we've been taking many different steps. It's been important to assess what a country can do when it faces a disaster of that scale, and we can look forward and see what we might do in the future.
Bajo esa realidad, bajo ese escenario real, la conciencia de todo el pueblo colombiano, pero en particular
what was very important in these cases was the awareness of the Colombian population, but also legislative steps to react to these disasters. One of the many issues then is legislation, and the Congress in Colombia works with the government to put forward proposals for an integral policy on disaster management. As a result of that, Colombia now has a platform for the future, and we have a number of very clear proposals here today for the HFA, which can be seen as a parallel with that policy in Colombia. We've looked at a number of very fundamental issues, participation of the private sector. The private sector at the national and the international levels has to be a key part of what's going on, because the private sector generates risk too. We've worked on that in great detail, and it's very important. We also need to work with communities. Communities have to be in the lead as well. They need to be committed, they need to be involved, and they need to benefit from these processes. They need to be part of the strategies which are being developed. A previous speaker mentioned that not even civil servants knew what was going on with the HFA. So if they don't know, how can communities know? We need to improve the information that's given, put it in context, and really include that in our plans. Another thing to mention is that in many cases disasters lead to lessons learned. People remember disasters, and they can be built into strategies which are being developed for the future.
Good, thank you very much. I will allow that to be the concluding comment for today. We've just hit 6 o'clock, but I'll just test your patience with an effort to summarize. What I've heard today is, over the years I've heard that the biggest challenge you felt we had to fix with HFA2 was the integration of disaster risk and climate change adaptation. And today I appreciate, and I'm sure that Michel Charot's presence helped us. You've actually provided a lot of very practical suggestions for how that can be done, which will help us to try to formulate what should be the content of that. The second big area of challenge really that you put forward is information, access, free access. You mentioned copyright issues, but it's a lot of issues in knowledge and information, and its usability. It's bringing back the science into the middle of HFA. I think we've heard that message loud and clear, both as a demand and also as an offer. And maybe I heard something about bringing science out of universities a bit and into the community. We've also talked about governance indirectly and directly. A few comments about accountability, also a lot about institutional mechanisms, about coordination. But I'd like us to come back there tomorrow and actually talk about what can be done. What are some of the things that we now have opportunity to really tackle? Again, serious round of everyone says local. The most used word in this conference, I think, is community and the local. Now, what in practice is it? I mean, empowering, yes. What is required? What's the mutual contract between the local and the center and the global in order to operationalize the commitment and the understanding that we all seem to carry, that is a critical way forward. So please, let's also come back to the practice there tomorrow and put some substance into that commitment. Because if we want to make this an international guidance instrument, some of the tricks really are in how concrete we can be. We've had a few, I'll throw some catch phrases onto you. The holistic integrated, of course, has been there, which is not only an ethical vision, it's also a very practical thing. So again, the glass walls are still standing there. It's not only an issue of finance, but there are also other institutional issues. The financing strategies. Tomorrow in this session, we will have a group of invited reinsurance experts, and I would like them to speak to you a bit about the potential of not only today's insurance, but maybe also tomorrow's insurance. But it's not only that, it's also government spending, it's better integration program strategies. The access to disaster data, the climate information has been amply covered. The future risk issues, universal design for resilience, We talked a lot about education and public awareness. Transboundary risk management has come up a lot today, also in the ministerial session this morning. I'm very happy with that. And many of you have repeatedly come back and said, particularly your comment on the session, the plenary this morning, the private sector, we have to find ways and means for a much closer association and integration of the private and the public. Here at the end, I think a lot of reference to how legislation can enable action, but also there has been a strong mentioning of the risks with the gap in the policies that many countries have. So yesterday we had a first round table on normative frameworks. Can legislation help to reduce disaster risk? And in that case, what type of legislation or policies are required? I also thank those of you who offered a few examples of things that did not work, of not so good practices, also to balance off the many successes we've heard of. And finally, there's been many calls for the human face of the HFA2. The presence of young people here, people living with disabilities and gender issues, that they have to take stronger prominence, both in the chair summary this time was a specific call, but also we have to formulate an HFA that puts people at the center of it. I don't know if you think that's a satisfactory summary, but we'll do a better one. And I would like to thank you for your stamina on this 3-hour discussion. And please come back tomorrow at 3 p.m. for more. And now I'd like to invite you to a demonstration of the tangible Earth model. If you haven't seen it yet, it's going to be presented on the 2nd floor. And after that, the city of Geneva and the Canton de Genève and the Swiss Confederation is offering you a drink or two upstairs. Please join them. Thank you for today.